Hi, Alyssa.
Hello, how are you?
Not too bad, thanks. Oh, how do I turn this on?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, thank you.
Okay, great. I'm still like trying to collect my thoughts from Melissa's fantastic keynote. I'm just like, wow, that was amazing.
Yeah, I was supposed to be making notes to write down later, but mine was so focused on the talk, I didn't manage to. It was so good.
How are you all? How's everyone else doing today?
I'm good. Thank you.
Good. I'm looking forward to your papers.
How is everyone? How's it going?
Good.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is our Broken Identities Healing Places panel. We're just going to wait for the last couple of people to come in for about 5 minutes, but we'll get started soon. Okay, so I'm going to make a start now. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed the conference so far. We're now starting our panel, Broken Identities, Healing Places. This panel looks at the histories of members of the Black and ethnic minority communities and explores the ways in which these groups formed a shared identity in the face of oppression. Chairing this panel, we have Dr. Kanetta Harriman-Perry from De Montfort University. Her research interests include Black British history, transnational race politics, archives of Black Europe, and anti-racist movements for citizenship and recognition. She is currently researching histories of state-sanctioned racial violence and the relationship between the decline of the welfare state and the expansion of the carceral state in Britain during the second half of the 20th century. Before I pass over to Dr. Harriman-Perry, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. We will be answering audience questions at the end, so please type any questions that you have into the Q&A function throughout the talks. If you're experiencing any technical issues or you think that one of our presenters is, please use the chat function to message us. For any other issues, please email marginstocenterug@gmail.com and one of the team will try and help you. If you're tweeting about the conference today, please use the hashtag UGHistConf so we can find your tweets and share them. That's everything from me, so I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Harriman-Perry.
Hi, Grace. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really glad to be here. I was not able to make last year's conference, but I just want to first, before we begin, just really give a huge shout out to the conference organizing team. You all are doing incredibly path-breaking, necessary work in the historical profession in the UK. And as a result of this panel, I can see internationally as well. So I just wanted to give a huge congratulations to the work that you all are doing and all that's gone in behind the scenes to pull this together and to curate really important conversations. So I just left the keynote and I was just saying how wonderful and just thought-provoking that was. And I'm sure it's been a full day of that. So I am really excited to be the moderator for this afternoon session. And I'm just gonna kind of let you all know, I'm gonna do a short introduction of all of our speakers, and then I will allow each of the speakers to give their papers and then offer a bit of a short kind of commentary on some of the issues that they've raised in the papers, and then we'll open up to Q&A. I wanna allow as much time as possible to engage in some of the ideas that the panelists are putting on the table today. So I am going to, again, start by introducing our panelists today. Our first speaker, Alyssa Broadbent, is currently pursuing a BA in history with a concentration in sociology at Trinity Western University in Canada. Alyssa has been awarded the President's Scholarship and the Dean's Scholarship for academic achievement. And additionally, it should be noted that Alyssa has been involved in curating a digital magazine which confronts the topic of colonized bodies and colonized spaces, which is also something that I think is part of the theme of the paper that she'll be presenting on today. Today, she will be sharing research from a paper entitled "What a Tangled Web We Weave, the Children of Colonization." So warm welcome to you, Alyssa. Next, we'll have Gabrielle Holloway. And she is pursuing a degree in history at the University of St. Andrews. Gabrielle's been active in campus life, serving as a BAME Access Conference volunteer and a student ambassador. As part of her dissertation research, Gabrielle intends to explore the ideologies of the British Black Power movement. And today she will actually be speaking from a paper related to that topic titled "We Were All One Family, Community in Britain's Black Power Movement." Welcome, Gabrielle. Our last speaker will be Hannah Canome. And Hannah is pursuing a degree in history at Oxford University. She has been active in the Race and Resistance Network, which is an amazing group of student activists and thinkers at Oxford that's really doing great work thinking about sort of race and resistance historically. And she's also been involved in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which focuses on decolonizing Oxford's curriculum and spaces, and has been part of a larger kind of conversation in the sector about some of these issues. And his research interests include carceral histories and prisoner resistance, and that will also be part of the work that she'll be sharing today, speaking from a paper titled Resisting the Carceral State, Prison Abolition and the Attica Rebellion of 1971. So again, a warm welcome to all of our panelists today, and I'm going to turn first to Alyssa.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. And can everybody see the PowerPoint? Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, hi everyone, I'm Alyssa, and my presentation is called What a Tangled Web We Weave, the Children of Colonization. So when starting my research, I was interested in exploring what some of the experiences of mixed race children were in different colonial societies. Where did they fall between the margins to center of these societies? Did they occupy unique positions and spaces? Were they mobile in the social structures? Did they have agency? And what can their experiences tell us about marginalized history in the context of colonial societies? And before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I am not mixed race, I'm white, and I'm not speaking from any personal cultural experience, but from the perspective of settler society. And my conclusions are simply drawn from some of the research that I've done on the subject. So specifically, I focused in on Spanish colonization in New Spain, French colonization in West Africa and Indochina, the antebellum Southern United States, and French and British colonization in Canada. My goal was to compare and contrast the experiences of mixed race individuals in these societies and see if common threads of experience or major points of contrast arose. So my research brought me to the conclusion that colonial powers have often formed sexual relationships with those inhabiting the lands in order to strengthen their domination of those lands. Colonization did not limit itself to the occupation and settlement of physical space, but extended in varying forms to the subjugation of cultures, languages, and peoples. Sexual relationships between the colonizers and those who inhabited the lands originally were often constructed and restricted in ways that propped up colonial hegemony and reinforced colonial systems. Mixed race children were subject to unique and varying experiences that often reflected the attitudes of that particular colonial society towards race. Although marginalized, these individuals occupied critical positions in challenging colonialism's racialized social structures and power imbalances. So first, I looked at the cast of paintings of 18th century Mexico, which depicted so-called racial mixing in colonial Spanish America. These paintings convey discourses of power and status in the Spanish Empire, where, as Susan Dean Smith suggests, the colonial subject was portrayed as a racially mixed but productive cog in Spain's imperial machine. Different subjects were most often portrayed and separated not only by race, but the occupation associated with their race. Spanish men were depicted as professionals, merchants, and men of leisure. Indigenous individuals as food vendors, Black individuals and those with mixed Black or mixed Indigenous ancestry as coachmen, others as tailors, shoemakers, masons, cooks, and spinners. Overall, the paintings function as an aestheticization and idealization of mixed race peoples, emphasizing productive labor, consumption, and commerce in New Spain, in which the new colonial subjects, the children, were seen as the future of Spanish imperialism. So historians can use these paintings to understand how New Spain was highly racialized and how race was used to structure Spanish American colonial society. However, it is integral to remember that the artists too shaped the portrayal of their subjects and how each person was portrayed according to preconceptions about their perceived race. Thus, while these paintings function as a reflection of Spanish American colonial society, it must be recognized that this reflection is smeared with racial biases and prejudices that directed the artist's portrayals of their subjects, perpetuating the stereotypes and clouding the ability for historians to uncover the genuine experiences of mixed race individuals in Spanish America, apart from how they were simply painted. So looking next to French colonialism in West Africa and Indochina, I identified specific attitudes towards mixed race relationships that affected the experiences of mixed race kids. In general, French colonial administration advocated for intermarriage for economic or social benefits for the white minority. French men were never prevented from engaging in relationships with the women of the lands that were colonized, even as support for such relationships began to shift. Most fathers did not register or recognize their kids, depriving them of French citizenship and legal status, while often abandoning them and returning back to France, to their French families. The French state perceived a responsibility to these so-called morally abandoned kids, who they viewed as orphaned to their mothers' families. Most significantly, they were seen as threats to colonial security because of their unique positions and understandings. Different attempts by the French government to civilize and educate the children included sending them to specific schools while extending opportunities for graduates in colonial administration. Sometimes French authorities forcibly removed the children from their communities against the will of their families to culturally isolate them, pressuring them to transform into, ideally, loyal French colonists. In the antebellum Southern United States, interracial relationships and mixed-race children were seen primarily as threats to the color line. Often a marked bias was expressed in antebellum life, favoring mixed-race enslaved people over non-mixed-race enslaved people. Mixed-race individuals were often preferred as house servants or plantation tradesmen, while being given more freedom of movement and better educational opportunities, food, clothing, and shelter. Despite this, they were perceived, as I said before, as threats to the slave system and its instituted racial hierarchy, as dangerous reminders of the oppressiveness and illegitimacy of slavery. There was a general fear that the American system of slavery could not handle a sliding scale of color prejudice and required a rigid color dichotomy to maintain power. Although some fathers publicly recognized their children, each act was nonetheless tied to the villainy of slavery. Could their mothers even have truly consented when they were enslaved person and slave owner in conditions of extreme domination based on race and gender? Even if freed, most children lost all connection with their fathers and encountered complex difficulties, discrimination, and levels of rejection from both Black and white communities. Canada's colonial history also reflects unique experiences of mixed-race children. Early on, French settlers were encouraged to intermarry with the Indigenous peoples, influenced by the colonial desire to tap into local knowledge, expertise, and specifically access to the fur trade. Through this, their Métis children served as integral go-betweens, often called children of the fur trade. Métis women were sought as marriage partners for fur trade managers because of their close ties and understanding of both local First Nation and Métis communities. As colonizers increased exploitation and aggression, they saw the Indigenous peoples more and more as threats to their colonial goals. This meant efforts began to dispossess the Indigenous peoples of their lands and eradicate their cultures. Networks of residential schools in Canada were set up in efforts to assimilate Indigenous peoples through such generational eradication of culture and language, including psychological, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Mixed race kids were not exempt from this experience in residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada asserts that there was no single experience of mixed race kids in residential schools, but often that they were rejected by not only their peers, but the colonial administration, who saw them as threats to Eurocentric ideas of racial and cultural superiority. So my research of comparing the experiences of mixed race children in these specific colonial societies has led me to conclude that whatever the aims and motivations of different administrations, the upbringing of mixed race children was a priority through which colonial authorities sought to manage colonial subjects and shape and maintain the social order. Colonialism imposed power structures and hierarchies that were centered not only around race, but also gender, occupation, and other identities. Mixed race individuals challenged these hierarchies and power imbalances, and therefore colonial governments as a whole, through their unique positions and experiences, even by their mere existence. They acted to shift understandings and assumptions of race within the highly racialized structures that were imposed upon them. What is important is allowing such histories to come forward and attempting to understand as many experiences as we can in colonial societies. We are still addressing many of the consequences of colonialism. As just one example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action are nowhere near fulfilled, as stories continue to emerge regarding experiences under the residential school system, and justice is still being hard fought for by Indigenous communities in Canada. Settlers must come to the table willing to listen to, not drive the story. The exploration and comparison of mixed race experiences in colonial societies is integral to most accurately conceptualizing and studying marginalized history, especially in terms of colonialism, the effects of colonization, and its continuing ramifications. I argue that exploring this is key to decolonizing history, dismantling systemic racism in the field, and moving forward in true reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you for that paper, Alyssa. I think the interesting connections that you made between sort of the presence of, or the relationship between these historical narratives and sort of how we think about the present and certain issues in the present is really an important point to end on there. I want to welcome Gabrielle.
I'm just going to share my screen. Currently having a bit of an issue with that. Wait 1 second.
Are you still experiencing difficulty with sharing the screen properly?
Yeah,
Oh. No, here we go. I can see it now.
You can see it. Okay, cool.
Okay, brilliant.
Stop. Neil Kenlock, the official photographer of the British Black Panther movement, stated that members within the party viewed themselves as one family. This statement is revealing of the sense of kinship that was felt by those within the Black Power movement. Activists within the movement often lived, studied, and organized together, and in this presentation I consider how they engaged with each other as well as with the wider community. Sociologist Patricia Hill Collins has noted the importance of the idea of community as a site of affirmation, identification, and political expression. The political projects of the US Black Panthers and their British counterparts were often advanced within a framework of community control. And for Collins, this advocacy of community control was a demand for power. And this raises the question of what power looked like for those involved in the movement. In a speech delivered in August 1967 by C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian historian and Marxist described Black Power as a banner for people with certain political aims, needs, and attitudes, a banner around which they can rally, a symbol of tremendous change in life and society as they have known. Black Power can be characterized as a movement that was centered around the issue of self-determination for Black people, as well as being anti-imperial and anti-capitalist in nature. The question of what is Black Power also begs the question, what is Blackness? The concept of political blackness was a key tenet of the British movement. As noted by Tanisha C. Ford, blackness held multiple meanings as it was a political affiliation and cultural identity in which non-white groups mobilized together against racism from the British state and the general public at large. In an article from their newsletter, the Black Liberation Front defined Black people as all non-white people of African, Asian, Caribbean, and Latin American origin. This was a movement that championed transnational solidarity across the diaspora. Now here are some key dates surrounding the Black Power movement, as well as just racism in general, and some key groups are on the other side. The Immigration Acts aim to limit new Commonwealth immigration into Britain by connecting immigration and the right to citizenship with the ability to trace Anglo-Saxon heritage. The Mangrove 9 trial has often been described as the peak of the Black Power movement in Britain and was recently dramatised in the Steve McQueen Small Axe series. And this was a key moment as it highlighted the racial bias and racial hatred that was within the Metropolitan Police. And here are some key groups that were involved in the movement, but for the focus of this presentation, I will mainly deal with the activities of the British Black Panthers. At its peak, the British Black Panthers had 300 members across multiple branches. Linton Crazy Johnson, the poet and member of the youth division of the Panthers, noted that you couldn't just become a Panther just like that. You needed to have a history of service within the community in order to be invited to join. And membership was something akin to a lifestyle choice. Despite their small numbers, the Black Power groups were able to mobilize hundreds and thousands of people for rallies and demonstrations across the country. Anne-Marie Angelo has noted that the Panthers organised 364 events between 1969 and 1973, ranging from public protests, prison and hospital visits, as well as cultural events. These events aimed to shed a light on the history of Black people from both within and outside the UK, filling in the gaps from the UK public school curriculum. The Panthers owned 4 houses in London, and these houses were located in Brixton, Clapton, Acton, and Finsbury Park. These places became spaces in which the Panthers planned how they would serve their communities, and they also were places for socialisation. The main headquarters was on Shakespeare Road in Brixton, and this site had a dark room, bookshop, library, and reading room. The communal spaces that the Black Power activists interacted in extended beyond the places that the Panthers owned and rented themselves. A key example of this is the Mangrove Restaurant on 8 All Saints Road, Notting Hill, which became the centre of the Mangrove 9 trial. In a political statement, the Mangrove was described as a place that served the interests and needs of the Black community. It was a place where activists and the general public alike could come together to discuss theory, plan, organise and relax, and also attracted a celebrity clientele including Jimi Hendrix. And because of its connection to the Black Power movement, it was continuously raided by the police. Desmond's was another space what served the needs of the Black community. Many of the young people that were connected to the Black Power groups would visit Desmond, and as a result, the police would target it as they viewed it as sites of cultural and political resistance. The venues associated with the Black Power movement led to constant surveillance and acts of violence by the police. An example of this occurred on the 15th of November 1969, in which Nigerian diplomat Clement Gonwalk parked his Mercedes outside Desmond's, and he was physically removed from his car and accused of stealing by the police. Those from within the store and surrounding areas came outside to intervene. Upon his arrest, a violent outbreak occurred in which Olive Morris was brutally beaten. The Clement Gonwalk incident also reveals the gender dynamic to the oppression faced by Black people, as Morris was targeted by the police not only because of her race, but as well as her gender. The Black Panthers were an explicitly feminist organisation and were against sexism, and they were one of the few Black Power groups to be led by a woman, Althea Jones LeConte. In an article from their newspaper called Freedom News, it proclaimed that there can be no Black liberation without the liberation of women, Black women, but there can be no liberation of Black women unless we struggle to liberate ourselves. Who else will do it for us? As noted by W. Chris Johnson, women's liberation was not always a central demand for those involved in the Black Power movement, as an earlier iteration of the Panthers, known as the UCPA, dropped this demand in July 1968, and they argued that women's place belonged in the home. This highlights the competing visions of community and Black Power and the role that people have to play in it. Here are my sources.
All right, thank you for that. I think your paper opened up a lot of different ways that we can think about the ways in which Black Power work, particularly in terms of the kind of London as a hub around some of the Black Power activity that we have in terms of the sources that you're working with. So I'm looking forward to discussing that a bit more. Next, we will turn to Henna.
Yes, let me share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes, great, thank you.
Perfect, amazing. I guess first of all, thank you, Alyssa and Gabrielle. Those were wonderful presentations. Alyssa, talking about what you talked about in terms of the colonial system, sort of breaking at the seams by the very thing it produces was so fascinating. And Gabrielle, Black Power in London is so under discussed and explored. So it was so fascinating hearing about that. My talk today, as you can probably see by my PowerPoint presentation, is on the Attica Prison Rebellion of 1971. And this prison rebellion is really part of this broader wave, very radical prison rebellions in the late 60s, early 70s America. And I'm specifically going to be looking at this prison rebellion in terms of its relationship to prison abolition. But first, what was the Attica Prison Rebellion? For decades, prisoners at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York had complained of the prison's dire living conditions and racist and abusive guards. The rebellion really starts off as sort of an accident. It's this localized outbreak of violence that was quite common in prisons, but it very quickly spills into this prison-wide rebellion. So prisoners organize themselves, they set up makeshift tents, organizing medical supplies, distributing food and water cans. And out of the 1,300 or so prisoners present, about 10 leaders are elected to negotiate demands with the prison authorities. And these demands included things like access to healthcare, increased wages, the removal of violent guards, which I think gives us an idea of what the conditions were like before the rebellion. The rebellion lasts 4 days, but it comes to an abrupt end when the governor of New York, Rockefeller, ordered the recapture of the prison. State troopers, who were heavily armed, stormed the prison, resulting in the death of 43 men. So I want to look today at an underexplored aspect of the rebellion: prison abolition. In contemporary American prison abolition movements, Attica, is quite famous. It's used as this example of state brutality, and also the the desperation prisons foster amongst prisoners. But the position of the rebels themselves as abolitionists has fallen into obscurity. And I think this is largely because during the state takeover, the main leaders of the rebellion were mocked out and assassinated intentionally, and many of their documents destroyed. So it's really difficult to recover this abolitionist ideology, but I hope to sort of make some inroads into this in my presentation today. So if we want to explore how the rebels are abolitionists, what is prison abolition in the first place? Abolition not only calls for the dismantling of the prison system, but also of the logic that justifies and naturalizes prisons in the first place. Abolition asks us to reject reform as not only inefficient, but actively counterproductive. And abolition is not just this destructive entity. It's also about building new alternative practices and figuring out new ways of confronting harm. And one of the reasons why people don't really look to the rebellion as an example of prison abolition is because to the prison authorities, prisoners produce this manifesto of demands, which are very reformist in tone. They ask for things like more doctors on hand and better wages and better guards, things that sort of add to the prison system rather than challenging its core tenets. But I argued that actually these demands from the rebels are more of recognition of what the state could give them, which admittedly was not much, rather than any real ideological belief on their part. So I argue if we look beyond this manifesto of reformist demands, we can actually see abolition quite a lot. So I'm going to start with this letter from Jewish prisoner Sam Melville. He's one of the leaders during the rebellion, and he had been convicted of bombing government buildings as part of his communist leanings. So in this letter, just 2 weeks before the rebellion, Melville wrote, "Among the problems we face is how to avoid the obvious classification of prison reformers." And then he goes on to say, "When you come right down to it, of course, there's only one revolutionary change as far as the prison system in America is concerned." And this is so abolitionist in tone. He rejects reform. He doesn't want to be called a prison reformer. He wants that revolutionary change that transforms the prison system in its totality. And how does this sort of understanding of the rebels as abolitionists change our understanding of the rebellion itself? Well, I think when we start to see leaders like Melville as abolitionists, you start to understand the rebellion not just as a protest against Attica and its dire living conditions and abusive guards, but a wider protest against the prison systems as a whole, as these things that are systematically destructive. And this critique extends to sort of the values that justify and underpin prison abolition, namely that of crime and punishment. So Melville also produces this prison newsletter that he creates and distributes in secret to other prisoners. And there's a lot of interesting language going on here, but of particular note is this line that says, no matter how heinous the crime you have been convicted of, no matter how many people you offed, drugs you pushed, whores you ran, places you robbed, you are a political prisoner just as much as Angela. And here he's referring to Angela Davis, who had been a target of law enforcement for her communist and Black power politics. But what Melville does, I think, so brilliantly is he says that all prisoners, not just political prisoners, none of them are criminals, none of them deserve to be in the prison system. Even those people who had committed socially unacceptable crimes like robbery or drug dealing. And how he does this is he's not arguing that these prisoners are innocent. He does admit that they have, robbed people or dealt these drugs. Instead, he argues that the system is guilty. No one should be in prisons because they're brutal places that dehumanize and oppress people. And so I guess relating it to the title of this panel, he's taking this broken identity, that of the criminal, and transforming it into something much more radical and revolutionary. And then finally, I wanted to consider, I guess, some of the different ways of reading abolition. Obviously, abolition is about opposing the prison system. It's about decarcerating people, getting them out of prison. But it's also about decolonizing your relations with other people. And I thought this poem by one of the Attica prisoners really exemplified this. So just to read it out, it says, Black brother, revolution is loving you for a change, calling you brother instead of mother for a change, even grinning at you for a change, then killing them, not you, for a change. I thought this was so powerful coming across this. So much of the prison system, and Attica especially is one of the worst prisons in New York, was about isolating prisoners, creating violence and tension amongst prisoners. But what this poem, very clearly says that, revolution is loving you. Revolution can also be about saying no to that system of violence and actually cultivating these empathetic modes of care and community. And I think the rebellion itself is an example of this. It served as a space of refuge for prisoners from the very routine and sanctioned violence they had experienced under the racist guards. And this isn't to romanticize the rebellion as this, violence-free space. People were disagreeing with each other, people chose sides, there was, interpersonal conflict for sure during this rebellion. But in thinking about how we can read it as abolitionist, I think Attica serves as this imperfect space where violence is acknowledged but not criminalized. So, it's different ways of responding to interpersonal conflict and violence. So yes, it's abolitionist in the sense that harm or violence isn't totally eradicated, but that it's not criminalized and punished so severely. And many of the Attica prisoners talk about this later, reflecting back on the rebellion. They say, they felt like they had been the living dead. Prison had crushed them, demoralized them, and being part of this collective where there was care and there was solidarity and understanding. One of the prisoners says he felt like he was reborn. So yes, my presentation, I hope I've shown some of the ways in which if we go beyond sort of what the rebels and prisoners presented to the authorities, that manifesto of demands. We actually see so many instances of abolition, whether that in Sam Melville and his letters and his newsletter, or in this poetry by Jamal. When it comes to resistance in the margins, I think we have to go beyond what is presented to the authorities to look at, to view and capture the full ideological and social diversity going on. And this is especially true in the context of prisoners and prisons. Prisons as a space are very horribly controlled. Prisoners are very vulnerable to state violence, retaliation, and surveillance. And so it's much more difficult for them to share their views in any sort of public way. So what the Attica prisoners presented to the public could be very different to the actual thoughts behind the scenes. And if we want to understand what is going on at the margins, we need to look beyond what is first given to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to just offer some quick reflections for the panelists, just to think about, to just begin our discussion. And I also want to take the time to just remind the audience to enter in any questions or comments that you'd like the panel to consider in the chat box feature. But I'll just start with Alyssa. I thought that sort of reminding us of the centrality of issues of sex and sexuality in terms of the colonial conquest, and reminding us of the ways in which that was part of a kind of racialized colonial project was really important, and the breadth of your paper kind of giving us this survey in all of these different geographical spaces. But one of the questions that I wanted to have you think a little bit more about, or say a little bit more about, is, how can we think about these categories changing over time in different spaces? In particular, if we think about concepts like miscegenation, mestizaje, mulatto, métis, how do we see that change over time in terms of even the legal ramifications associated with these questions about sort of interracial sex and the implications of interracial sex within the colonial project? So I'm curious about whether or not you could say a little bit more about that. Gabrielle, also, I think your paper is also opening up and in conversation with a lot of really great work that's happening in Black British history right now. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about is, there is this kind of sub-conversation about kind of opening up some of these conversations about the history of Black power beyond London. And I'm just curious about whether or not in your work thus far, do you kind of see ways of kind of moving us outside of London? Or on the flip side, if more of your work is London-based, why would you say there's such a kind of focus on London in some of these conversations around Black power, and maybe what does London open up that other spaces may not? So I'm just curious about getting you to say a bit more about, how we think about some of these themes within contemporary Black British history, like kind of movements around Black power and Black power politics from a kind of regional perspective. And then finally, Henna, I think your paper really opened up some really interesting concepts. And I think this is something I'm actually trying to think about in my own work, is about this question of kind of how we think about articulations of kind of abolitionism. And I think one of the things that really came out really strongly in your paper was this idea of thinking about prisoners not just as and not just thinking about them performing acts of resistance, but literally articulating political ideologies, and like really thinking about their actions and the kind of them as intellectuals, really, and how they're sort of articulating a vision of a kind of intellectual project about what abolition means. And I just would kind of invite you to say a little bit more about the ways in which their version of abolitionism, you kind of hinted at thinking about maybe not necessarily always dismantling the actual form of the prison, but like the function of it, and sort of thinking through, you know, what is the purpose of prison and how do we kind of create a different and radically different and revolutionary model of what a prison is supposed to do in society. And so I think that was one of the things that I would love to hear you say a bit more about that and how that is maybe offering a very useful way to think about the project and the political project of abolitionist discourse in the present. And so I would love to hear more about all of that. So I'm just going to pause. These are just kind of immediate thoughts about some of your papers, and I'll open it up to the panelists, and then I'll be keeping an eye out on the chat. So I'll start with the panelists first. I don't know if we want to go back in the same order in terms of doing a maybe quick response, follow up, and then we'll keep an eye on the chat.
Sure, I can start. So as your comment about legal terms and how kind of different terms for different groups of mixed race peoples, I found that very interesting. And it made me think about, in my research, I was reading a lot about specific court cases in the Southern United States where kids were trying to both get legal recognition of who their fathers were, and whether that's for inheritance or whatever, and how that kind of, the legal terms that were in use, there had to be kind of new terms that were constructed by the colonial administration in order to kind of facilitate that. And one thing I remember was interesting was how in a lot of situations, the mixed race individuals had to kind of not mention their mothers, who their mothers were, if they were wanting to be recognized in the court, because if they did, that would just cause issues in the minds of the judges or the people in the court of thinking who they were, and they just wanted to, if they wanted to be recognized for who their father was, they had to kind of dismiss who their mother was, which I thought was really sad and interesting. And when you were talking about changing kind of conceptions, it made me think about, specifically in Canada with the Métis communities, it originally started with just simply usually a local Indigenous woman and a settler father, but now in Canada, as time has went on, the Métis communities developed into their own distinct nation with distinct culture, and not just kind of as a like intermediary in Canada. Now they have their own identity within that. And I think terms and conceptualizations of mixed race individuals does change, and I think this is something I struggle with in my research, because this was, mixed race history was very new to me, and in terms of what I knew about it. And I think it was difficult for me to know how to refer to different groups and people without, while recognizing their unique experiences, but also not just using certain terms when referring to them and putting them into a box of like, this is who they are, this is their experience. So especially with what a lot of those terms insinuate. So yeah, that's just my immediate thoughts on your comments.
Thank you. Thank you. Gabrielle, do you want to respond?
So regarding London, I think, at least with what I've read so far, it seems like as the Black Panthers, like from the 70s onwards, there was a increasing awareness of like the need to collaborate with other parts of other power movements within the UK. So it's like reflected in the material that they produced in the newspapers, because initially at the front pages are very like London centric, but then as time went on, they like acknowledged more events that were happening. And then Neil Kenlock, who I mentioned at the beginning, in an interview, he described that the Panthers took on like a rent a mob phenomenon, where they would essentially go to different parts of the UK where they heard about issues of racial injustice. So I think and they also collaborated with the Afro-Caribbean Circle in Birmingham, who's another Black Power group. But I think in terms of research, it tends to be a lot more London-centric, maybe because the way like Britishness is viewed is very from like a London base and very like urban kind of way, which probably influences the way in which we understand Black Power.
And then Hannah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for the comments. They were so profound and insightful. And I've been a fan of your work for ages. I saw the race and resistance talk you did a couple of weeks back, and it was so good. So it's so nice to be on a panel with you. Yeah, and I'd love to hear what you think about abolition and how it related to your work, if possible. But yeah, just to respond to those comments, I think what Attica teaches us, or how we can relate Attica to present prison abolition movement is, I think, in the news, so much of the rhetoric and response to prison abolition was that it was this ill thought out kind of new sort of phenomenon by leftists who were just very utopian and didn't understand the prison system. And I think when you sort of look at the long trajectory of prison abolition, you realize that's just not true. People have been formulating it for decades, half a century almost. So that to me is the what I took from researching Attica. I think also Attica, not only teaches us that abolition has a long historical trajectory, but also that, I think Attica teaches us some lessons, right? Attica was repressed, it was shot down, and the response to Attica from the mainstream American sort of political establishment, both Democrat and Republican, is to use it as a justification for increasing prisons. This is a time when mass incarceration is being sped up, and the radicalness of Attica helps law and order conservatives to say, we need stricter prisons. One of the direct responses to Attica is to start building maximum security prisons, which completely isolate prisoners, so rebellions like this won't happen. So I think Attica, it's both really instructive in teaching us about abolition and the ideas that come along with abolition, but also it's a lesson learned about how sort of abolition can be picked up by conservatives and reactionaries to justify the very things we're opposing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for just those really thoughtful responses. I'm going to turn to, we have some questions coming in the chat. I'm going to kind of lump things together and then do kind of another roundup across the panel. We have someone who wanted to know from you, Henna, about what inspired you to study prison rebellions, and sort of kind of giving us a little bit of the genealogy behind the development of your project and your research interest. And then there's a question from Olivia to Alyssa specifically, but also I think this is a more general question, because there's a many ways in which I think all of your papers are actually raising sort of histories that are speaking very much to contemporary issues. But Alyssa, we cannot, I think you can't get away from this question about quote unquote mixed race discourse and in popular discussions about Meghan Markle, particularly in the context of transatlantic race politics at the moment. So I'm curious about a response to a question about, do you think that we see some of these colonial ideas about mixed race people in popular discussions about Meghan Markle? Do we see a kind of repackaging of some of that discourse that you've talked about in your paper? And then we also, Alyssa had another question from Emma, who's also interested in knowing a little bit more about some of the Costa paintings that you showed, and if you could say a bit more about who they were made by and for, and kind of what their social function was, if you can say a little bit more about that. And then Gabrielle, there's a question about your project and how you could imagine histories about British Black power making their way into the UK educational context. Esther has noted that we learn a lot about African-American histories in the kind of British educational context when there are these discussions about race and civil rights. But what do you think about the place of histories of British Black power in the wider educational context there? So I'm gonna turn over to the panel again, and I don't know who might want to go first, but.
I guess I've had the most time to reflect on the question, so I'll go for it. Yeah, that's a super interesting question. What drew me to these very, I think to contemporary eyes, strange prison rebellions? We don't, see those in our current landscape right now. I think what really kicked off my interest was sort of the resurgence of BLM after the execution of George Floyd in the summer, and those discourses of prison abolition, I was really intrigued, like, what was prison abolition? It's not a discourse that really permeates the UK in the same way. And once I started to look into it historically, I was just blown away by how radical prisoner rights movements had been in the 70s. Like, and I wanted to find out, like, why were people rebelling, you know, what were the conditions that brought this about, what did they think? And I think just the radicalness and sort of my dream of, you know, resurrecting that radicalness someday soon sort of drove my interest.
Mm, mm.
I can speak next to the question from about the Casta painting. So from my understanding, they were produced primarily in Mexico. Like I said, I think 18th century around there, by Spanish artists. And from what I remember reading, they were mostly bought by those in colonial administration and kind of displayed in their homes or in those kind of spaces. And it was interesting. One of the things I was reading was how some saw it as kind of, yeah, examples as like, oh, this is like colonial productivity, like this is what we have done, like, and kind of almost like a fetishization of the mixed race peoples in the colonies of, you know, this is what they're doing now, like we've done this for them, like by these racist ideas. But then others were in other Spanish people were looked at them and saw them as like, this is like defamatory towards the white race, and examples of like muddying the waters of racial purity and things like that. So they were controversial, I would say, and yeah, but mostly bought and kind of displayed by those in colonial administration.
Did you want to say anything at all about the kind of contemporary issues around Meghan Markle at all? I know it's a
Right, yeah, sorry.
that's like a whole can, or it can be a whole
Yeah.
can of worms, but
Yeah, so about that, I definitely feel like it's a lot of definitely still the effects of colonial thinking regarding race and racial hierarchy that is persisting. And even though it's not explicit necessarily all the time, it's this very covert racism and ideas about mixed race people. And I think that is, yeah, definitely a lot of how that kind of discussion is happening, and how, yeah, discussions about Meghan Markle. So yeah, it is a big question, but I do think it's a continuance of these racist ideas that's stemming from colonial thinking.
Yeah. And also I would probably even add, you know, really not even about mixed raceness, but about whiteness, and the kind of colonial logics of whiteness that we see sort of repackaged and weaponized in different kinds of ways that you know, no matter what these different categories are also sort of exposing in these different terrains. Gabrielle, did you want to, you had a wide ranging question as well that you could go in a lot of different directions, but did you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think around 7 years ago, Robin Bunce, who's a historian who also works on this topic, stated that the Black Power movement in Britain was in danger of being forgotten. And I think the focus on like African American history instead of Black British history in the curriculum, it helps to like shield the realities of what's happening in the UK. Because that's why part of the Black Power movement in the UK, the campaigns were to create public education policies so they would understand, the Black community would understand their own history. So I think in terms of how it could be incorporated into the education system, I think it very easily could, but at the same time, there's a danger of it being flattened by the state to not fully capture the complexities of what was going on. And I think with the growth of like technology and like other platforms, it's easier for us to learn more about our own history. We don't necessarily need to rely on the state as like Black people, but I think it depends on who wants to learn and why, because not everyone will make the effort to want to learn about the Black Power movement.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point that you make too about flattening out. I mean, even when, if you're thinking about Black Power the Black Power movement, there's no other frame to study it other than through a kind of global internationalist frame. You cannot make it African American history. It is not nation specific. You know, people like Angela Davis and all of these sort of iconic figures, we cannot limit their political work and impact to a kind of US narrative. So it's sort of the erasure of a kind of, you know, British narrative about sort of the ways in which it's happening. These sort of connections are being made in the UK, but it's also a kind of narrowing of even a frame of whatever African American history is. So and how we sort of need to really think about Black histories through a kind of much more diasporic sort of global anti-imperial framework there. So I think that's a really important question. I just want to thank all of the panelists for really engaging papers that raised a lot of really interesting questions that for me, I have to say, are sort of, you know, I'm still really sort of sitting with the keynote from earlier today, you know, really allowing us to think about, you know, what the telling of these histories means for the present, and really sort of thinking about the politics of history. And I think this panel and the topics that were discussed, as well as the discussion that we've had here today, actually really bring a lot of that to the fore. So I know we're looking at time to wrap our session up. I'm going to turn back to you, Grace, to close us out.
Thank you very much. So thank you everyone for speaking. As Dr. Perry just said, we've heard some amazing things from you all, and you've all put so much hard work and research into what you've been doing and really come up with some thought-provoking questions for us all to go away and think about now. I'd like to say thank you to the audience for coming along and listening and asking a lot of really thought-provoking questions. We're now going to have a break from 5:10 until 5:25, but then please come back and join us at 5:25 for our panel on sexualities, defiance and hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.